What's going on, you 3D modeling beasts? This is Mussi, and welcome to part 5 of creating stylized environmental art using Maya, Zbrush, and Substance Painter. In this 5th and final installment of this series, I will walk you through my process of creating stylized textures within Substance Painter. This series is sponsored by Autodesk. The aim of this series was to be able to take any idea, any concept, or any existing model that you might have, apply certain stylized characteristics along with my workflow to create a beautiful piece of stylized environmental art. Also, if you're interested in following along with this project, I have made available for free the complete set of project files, which includes the blueprints. And I have included a link in the description down below, as well as a link in this YouTube card right here. If you missed the previous video in this series and you want to go ahead and catch up, I will also post it in this YouTube card right here. And in this 4th video of the series, I'll walk you through the entire process of creating a low poly mesh and UVing it all within Maya. Without further ado, let's get started. I'm gonna go ahead and begin breaking down my stylized texturing workflow within Substance Painter. The first thing that I'll do is create a new scene. These are the initial settings that I have. I pretty much use the standard settings here, no real big changes. One thing to keep in mind, however, is if you are, for example, bringing in normal maps from, say, Maya. Maya does use OpenGL as their default normal map format. So if you are creating, say, normal maps from Maya and you're bringing them into Substance Painter, you most likely want to change this setting from DirectX to OpenGL to properly display that normal map within the viewport. Now that our project is created and that low poly mesh is imported into our scene, I'm going to go ahead and break down step by step my stylized texture creation process within Substance Painter. Step number 1 is to bake my mesh maps. I'm going to give you a quick overview of some of the more important settings that I actually use. Let's go ahead and begin by taking a look at the common parameters. These common parameters will actually influence any other map that you have checked on the left-hand side. The first thing that I want to cover is the output size. For most of my texture sets, I will be using a 2K texture size. The next thing that we want to do is bring in that high definition mesh. This is that mesh that we created in Zbrush and then we decimated in order to be able to bring in right here and actually extract that normal map detail from that high poly over to this low poly mesh. The max frontal and the max rear distances, these essentially are going to correlate with the distances from that low poly mesh and the high poly mesh. Normal map baking is really centered around shooting off rays and distance thresholds. That's why in the low poly creation phase, I tried my hardest to keep those silhouettes of the low poly and the high poly relatively close. If your variances are very, very large, you could get into trouble in this phase. Usually what I do is I leave these values at default and then I do an initial test bake, and then seeing the information that comes back, I'll go ahead and adjust these values accordingly. The next setting that I want to cover is the anti-aliasing. This is going to give you a nice visual fidelity to your maps. I really don't like going to a 8x8 just because it does take exponentially longer to actually bake at that size, and you most likely won't see a big improvement within those bakes. The last setting within the common parameters that I want to cover is the match by name feature within Substance Painter. This is why we spent all that time, if you remember, in the blockout phase, getting the naming convention properly named between the low poly objects and the high poly objects. Using this naming feature to bake within Substance Painter will let Substance Painter essentially match your low poly to your high poly. And that simple act right there will make the baking process go a lot smoother and avoid many common baking errors. A side note to this naming convention is that you could actually tell Substance that this suffix could really be whatever you want it to be. However, underscore low and underscore high is a very commonly used naming convention, as it is the default within Substance Painter. I quickly want to cover the ambient occlusion and the curvature baker. These are pretty important maps in any texturing workflow, especially for stylized art, and that's because the ambient occlusion maps will correlate very well to creating stylized shadow information, as the ambient occlusion naturally builds up in areas that are close together. And then the curvature maps are going to lend themselves very well to creating those distinguished stylized edges that we already established are a key element for making stylized textures. Both of these maps heavily rely on rays for the quality of the bakes. So when doing my final bakes, I do like to have the ambient occlusion rays and also the curvature rays turned up at least halfway to all the way maxed out. Within both of these bakers, you could actually tell Substance Painter whether you want the other parts to actually influence your objects. And this is clearly marked in the self-occlusion setting that you see. So if you don't want other parts influencing your bake, you could actually change this from self-occlusion always to by mesh name. The last baker that I quickly want to cover is the ID map. Since we didn't really set up any specific material IDs within Substance Painter, what we could actually do is leverage this setting within Substance Painter, which is the mesh ID or polygroup. So any pieces that are a separate part, what Substance Painter is going to do with this setting is that it's going to give it a unique color. And this is going to speed up our workflow tremendously because it's going to allow us to drag a material from the browser, create a mask automatically using that color selection. That's all the bake settings that I wanted to cover. Let's move on to the next phase. Step number 2 in my stylized texturing process is to go through a process that I call added details, where essentially I'm going to be working with height information to add extra bits of tertiary detail that I actually left out within the high poly creation workflow. In the third video of the series, we took a look at some of the advantages of creating tertiary high poly details within Zbrush versus Substance Painter. Those high poly details were extracted from the high poly to the low poly mesh via the process of baking and converted into normal information. Now we're going to take a look at some of the advantages of creating height information within Substance Painter versus Zbrush. And this height information actually will get converted over to normal information once you export your maps out of Substance Painter. Benefit number 1 is procedural patterns. And I know that Zbrush does have the noise maker, but I do find that the procedurals within Substance Painter are pretty straightforward and pretty powerful to work with. If we take a look at this diamond pattern here that goes through the barbell and the curl bar, you'll see how easy it was to not only create this, but to adjust it and also mask it out. The second advantage that I like to creating some of these tertiary height details within Substance Painter is that I have the ability to stack filters. So not only can we create these diamond patterns, but we could actually add a filter like a blur to give this a nice soft bevel to this high detail that we just added. One of the other benefits that I like using Substance Painter for versus Zbrush, I know that Zbrush does have layers to sculpt on, but they don't seem to work as natively and fluidly as they do within Substance Painter. One of the great things that you can do with layers, not only can you change the blending mode for anything that describes color information, but you could actually change the blending mode for height information, and you're gonna get a different result and a different effect on how that height information actually stacks up. So in this added detail stage, you'll see me go through and add all these final tertiary details to my mesh, including the diamond patterns, the tape on the bench pad, and also the stitching. I really like creating the stitching within Substance Painter versus a package like Zbrush because it's a lot easier to come back and make edits. For example, I can add this filter within the actual stitches that I'm creating, set it to this chroma key green color, and then through this filter, I could actually swap that color for any stitching color that I eventually want. The next step in my stylized texturing workflow is to create my base colors. At this point, it is very important that you actually change the lighting to a neutral setup, meaning that whatever environmental light that you have within the environmental settings, you want to change this to an environment sphere that does not introduce any color. The problem with an environmental light that is introducing a lot of color into your scene is that it could dramatically throw off the colors within your textures. So for example, if you're texturing something that has a lot of reds in your scene, and then maybe you export that into a game engine with a more neutral lighting, all that red color is going to throw off your textures, and it's going to dramatically look different in neutral lighting conditions. So for that very reason, you most likely want to stick to the studio lighting setups, as these don't really introduce any additional colors within your lighting. The next task here is to make sure that all my base materials are relatively flat. This is one of those elements of stylized art that we took a look at in that first video of the series. For that very reason, I ensure that metallic values stay relatively low and roughness values stay relatively high as to compared to a more photorealistic texturing workflow. Once I have those base materials established, what I like to do is add additional fill layers and go through the process of breaking up all my base colors. This is very similar to what you would do in a more realistic workflow, where you go through and actually break up your roughness. Since we really don't have a lot of roughness variation in this texturing style, we're really gonna focus in breaking up these base colors instead. So what I'll do is I'll start adding additional fill layers and also adding masks. What you can do with these masks is add fill layers to the masks themselves, drag a procedural grunge material to these, and with that procedural grunge, really control the breakup of these colors and also the blend modes as these different layers stack and start breaking up your base colors. The next stage in my texturing workflow is to get the stylized edges to look correctly, to really nail down the stylized look. This part of the process is going to heavily rely on the curvature map, as baking out those curvature maps already did most of the heavy lifting by properly identifying the edges within our model. You'll see me use fill layers in assigning this fill layer a slightly lighter value than the previous base layers underneath. From that point, I'll go ahead and give this a mask and then assign it a curvature generator. What the curvature generator is going to allow me to do, along with all the controls and sliders, it's going to really fine-tune the look of that mask, which then in turn is going to translate into giving me the utmost control for the look of those stylized edges. Moving on, the next step is creating a shadow pass. This is almost the inverse of the edge pass that we just created. For this pass, we're heavily going to rely on the ambient occlusion generator, as the ambient occlusion map generally describes areas that are in close proximity, and these areas are usually the areas that are mainly within shadows. So for this very reason, we're going to go ahead and start with fill layers again. We're going to actually use darker tones this time, mainly using the multiply blending method. We're going to give this another mask, and we're going to use the ambient occlusion generator to describe those areas that I want in shadow or have some type of darker tones. Just like my color and my edge passes before, I do like to give extra breakup to the shadowed areas, mainly again using fill layers and also masks driven by procedural generators. The next step within my stylized texturing workflow is to apply any decals to my textures. I create most of my decals using Adobe Illustrator. I create these decals in two steps. One is to create the actual decal and the color information, And 2 is to create the mask that's going to cut out that decal to properly display within Substance Painter. So you'll see me export 2 files to create this one decal. And then using the projection tool within Substance Painter, I'll create a fill layer. The first thing that I'll do is set up the color information. Then I'll create a mask. And then within that mask, I'll go ahead and paint the mask or the alpha information to properly cut out that decal and have it look correctly within Substance Painter. The last step within my texturing workflow is the grunge pass. The grunge pass is where I add any dirt, any grime, or any dust where I'm looking to basically beat up my surfaces a bit. For this, I mainly use fill layers with masks, and these masks are typically driven by generators, as well as using some of the grunge procedural textures, essentially being plugged directly into that mask via a fill layer. That completes my stylized texturing workflow within Substance Painter. The last step here is to properly render this model. At this point, you really have 2 options. One, you could export all your textures using the export function within Substance Painter to take all your textures into your primary render. However, for this particular video, we're going to go ahead and render this all within Substance Painter using the powerful Iray renderer. To do so, we'll go ahead and hit the Iray button to essentially send this over to Iray. Iray is a very powerful render that is very easy to use. So even if you're a beginner, it's very easy to start rendering and hit the ground running. The first thing that we're going to do is select the correct lighting setup that we want our final renders to have. You have a different array of environments that are available via Substance Painter. However, if you can't find the right look to your HDRI image that you're looking for within Substance Painter, there is a great free resource called Polyhaven. I'll go ahead and throw the link down below. What you can do is go to this website and download any additional HDRI images and quickly throw them into Substance Painter to get the exact look that you're looking for your renders to have. Once you establish the final lighting for your model, the next thing that you want to do is set the right number of max samples that are basically going to get rid of most of the noise within your render. Iray is a progressive render, meaning that whatever value you have set to in the max samples, it'll render and it'll clean up that image until it gets to that threshold. The other step that you'll see me do here in Iray is to set a ground plane. This ground plane really helps level any props that you have if you actually don't have a physical environment modeled out. The floor plane really does a great job at giving you those soft contact shadows that really help ground your objects. You also have the ability to quickly set up depth of field, where you could essentially give focus to foreground objects while blurring background objects and really helping your render get that extra level of depth. You could easily do so playing around with the aperture and the distance settings within your camera settings. Once your render has completed, it's time to save this out. Substance Painter will let you export your image in a variety of formats. However, if you choose a format that supports a transparency, what that's going to allow you to do is save this out with a alpha mask. For example, if you export this out as a PSD, this will come in with a alpha channel, which will quickly allow you to create a mask and set up any background within Photoshop relatively easily. And that marks the end of my stylized texturing workflow within Substance Painter. After a great deal of work, these are the final renders to my stylized environmental art. Thank you so much for tuning in to this 5th and final installment of creating stylized environmental art using Maya, Zbrush, and Substance Painter. I also do want to give a big thank you to Autodesk for sponsoring this series. If you got any value from this video or even the entire series, I would really appreciate that you smash the like button, as it does help the channel grow tremendously. And I would also love to hear your overall opinions of not only this video, but the complete series, as well as any tips that you have for creating your own stylized textures within Substance Painter. That's all the time that I have for you folks. Thank you so much for tuning in again, and I will catch you next time.